The late afternoon sun bled a golden hue over Golden Ridge, Vermont, casting long, quiet shadows that stretched from the steepled church to the colonial-era storefronts. It was a Saturday, and the air in the supermarket parking lot hummed with a familiar, peaceful rhythm of car doors closing and shopping carts rattling over worn asphalt. Life here moved at a predictable pace, a gentle current of routine where neighbors exchanged pleasantries, and the biggest news was the upcoming bake sale. This was a town built on the foundation of serene predictability, a place where harmony was the unspoken rule. But on this particular afternoon, a small tear appeared in that tranquil fabric, a quiet gathering of people, a silent cluster of concern, and the slow, rhythmic flash of blue and red lights against the darkening pavement signaled that the town's steady heartbeat had just skipped a beat. Helena Caldwell emerged from the automatic doors of the supermarket, her posture as rigid and impeccable as the crisp lines of her tailored coat. At 58, she was a woman who moved through the world as if it were a courtroom she presided over, her face a mask of stern control and her intelligent eyes missing any hint of joy. She noticed the small commotion near the edge of the lot, a disorderly gathering that was an unwelcome disruption to the town's quiet choreography. Her first instinct was a familiar flicker of annoyance, but as she drew closer, she saw the source of the disturbance was not a fender bender or a teenage prank. It was a child, a small girl, standing perfectly still amidst the hushed whispers of onlookers and the calm, methodical questions of two police officers, seemingly lost in a world of her own. The story rippled through the small crowd in hushed, shocked tones. A little girl, simply left behind. The police had been quick, using security footage to locate the mother and bring her to the small brick station just across the street. Helena's route to her car took her directly past its entrance, an unfortunate coincidence she had no intention of indulging. Yet, she could not avoid the sound that sliced through the evening air. It wasn't a shout, but a declaration spoken with a voice as brittle and cold as winter ice. "I don't want her anymore. I can't take it anymore." The words were not meant for her, but they struck Helena with the force of a physical blow, lodging deep in her chest. They echoed a silent, terrifying fear she had buried years ago, the horrifying notion that love was not a permanent fixture, but something that could be discarded, something that could just end. Through the large window of the police station, Helena saw her. The little girl, Leah, was sitting on a bench in the corner, her back straight, her tiny feet not quite touching the floor. She wasn't crying or looking for anyone. Instead, her gaze was fixed on her own small hands as they traced intricate, invisible patterns in the air before her, utterly absorbed in a silent symphony only she could hear. The stark contrast between the mother's cruel dismissal and the child's innocent obliviousness shattered something deep within Helena. It wasn't pity she felt, but a raw, fiercely protective instinct she thought had died and been buried with her own daughter. A sudden, sharp pain bloomed in her heart, a powerful and undeniable command to act, to shield this small, discarded soul from a world that had declared her unwanted. Driven by an impulse she hadn't felt in 2 decades, Helena left the harsh lights of the police station behind and drove to the county's Child Protective Services office. The building smelled of stale coffee and a quiet, bureaucratic sadness, a place of last resort. In a small playroom decorated with faded cartoon animals, she found Leah. A kind-faced social worker was attempting to engage her with a worn-out teddy bear, but the little girl was in a world of her own, completely captivated by a small, grey stone she had discovered on the linoleum floor. She turned it over and over in her hands, her focus absolute, a low, melodic hum vibrating in her chest. For Helena, watching from the doorway, the girl's intense concentration was not a sign of deficit, but a shield, a silent and beautiful fortress built to withstand the storm that had just shattered her life. For 20 years, Helena had meticulously constructed a wall around the part of her heart that still ached for her daughter, Anna. Every memory was a brick, every unshed tear the mortar that held it in place. She actively avoided parks, schoolyards, and the sound of children's laughter, treating them as landscapes of unbearable pain. Now, watching Leah, she felt the first significant crack form in that hardened facade. She was struck by a phantom memory of Anna's own quiet intensity, the way she would arrange her small animal figures in perfectly straight lines. The recollection was sharp, but for the first time, it wasn't just pain. It was a ghost reaching out, urging her forward. The social worker, a weary woman named Sarah, approached with a clipboard, likely mistaking Helena for a curious town official, but Helena's gaze remained fixed on the small girl on the floor, lost in her private universe. Helena moved past the social worker and entered the room, her presence commanding yet gentle. She understood instinctively that to approach Leah directly, to force an interaction, would be a profound violation of the girl's sanctuary. Instead, she lowered herself to the floor a few feet away, her expensive wool coat pooling around her like a dark, protective shadow. The air was thick with a silence broken only by Leah's soft, continuous humming. Helena simply watched. Her formidable mind, so accustomed to dissecting legal arguments and witness testimonies, now trying to comprehend a different kind of truth. She observed the way Leah's small fingers traced the stone's edges and the slight, curious tilt of her head. It was a display of pure focus, an entire world away from the cold, dismissive words of her mother. It's moments like this that show you the incredible resilience of the human spirit. And if you believe these stories need to be told, subscribing to our channel helps us continue to share them. In a gesture that felt both alien and deeply natural, Helena leaned forward and picked up another small pebble from the floor, a nondescript piece of gravel likely tracked in on someone's shoe. She held it for a moment. Then, without a word, she placed it on the linoleum next to Leah's. She created a pair, a silent offering. For a long moment, nothing changed. The humming continued, a steady, unbroken rhythm. Then, slowly, as if surfacing from a deep dive, Leah's head lifted. Her immense blue eyes, which had been locked on her own world, turned to meet Helena's. It was not a look of fear or confusion, but one of deep, quiet assessment, a gaze that saw past the severe exterior to something else. In that shared stillness, a fragile connection was forged, a silent acknowledgement that passed between them. A bridge built across an impossible chasm of loneliness. The decision solidified in Helena's mind with the swift, irreversible force of a gavel striking wood. She rose to her feet, her movements once again imbued with their usual authority, and turned to the stunned social worker. "I am requesting temporary emergency custody," she stated, her voice calm but leaving no room for negotiation. Sarah stammered, talking about procedures, background checks, the unsuitability of Helena's vast, empty house. The news would ignite the town's gossip mill. Helena Caldwell, the reclusive Iron Widow, playing mother to a non-verbal child abandoned in a parking lot. The whispers would be cruel, painting her as either a fool or a predator, seeking some perverse form of atonement. But Helena was utterly indifferent to the impending storm of public opinion. Her focus was singular, locked on the small girl who was now cautiously nudging the second stone with her finger. The bureaucracy of the foster care system was a mountain of red tape, but Helena Caldwell was a woman who had spent her life leveling mountains. She leveraged her wealth, her connections, and her formidable understanding of the law to cut through the delays. Phone calls were made to people who owed her favors, and paperwork that should have taken weeks was completed in days. She endured the condescending home visits from social workers who saw her cold, immaculate mansion not as a home, but as a museum full of hazards. They questioned her age, her solitary lifestyle, her utter lack of recent experience with children. Every query was a thinly veiled judgment on her fitness, but Helena met each one with the cool, unassailable logic of a federal judge, her resolve hardening with every obstacle they threw in her path. Bringing Leah home was like introducing a delicate, wild bird into the gilded silence of a vast cage. The echoing halls of the Caldwell estate, once Helena's quiet refuge, became a minefield of sensory triggers for the little girl. The steady tick-tock of the grandfather clock in the foyer sounded like a hammer striking an anvil. The low hum of the Sub-Zero refrigerator was a monstrous roar. The first few days were a tense series of small, contained explosions of panic. A silver spoon dropped on the marble floor sent Leah scrambling under the dining table, humming a frantic, dissonant tune. The scratchy texture of an antique wool throw blanket caused her to recoil as if she had been burned. Helena felt completely, terrifyingly out of her depth. Her life of perfect order shattered into a million chaotic pieces. A cold dread began to seep into her bones, the fear of failing again. The town's judgment followed her like a shadow. During a rare trip to the market, she felt the weight of dozens of sideways glances and heard the abrupt cessation of hushed conversations as she passed. What could she possibly know about raising a child like that? One of her neighbors whispered to another, just loudly enough to be heard, "It's a vanity project. She'll be calling social services within a month." The casual cruelty of the remarks stung more than she would ever let on, reinforcing the profound sense of isolation that had defined her life for years. The woman who once commanded the unquestioning respect of Golden Ridge was now the subject of its pity and scorn. She retreated further into her mansion, the great house feeling less like a fortress and more like a shared prison for two lonely souls, each trapped in a world the other could not understand. Driven by a desperation she hadn't known since her daughter's accident, Helena turned to books. She ordered every text she could find on the autism spectrum, sensory processing disorders, and alternative forms of communication. Her mahogany-paneled study, once lined with volumes of case law and legal precedent, was now piled high with works on child psychology and therapeutic strategies. She learned about the calming pressure of weighted blankets, the importance of predictable routines, and the subtle cues that preceded a sensory meltdown. Slowly, painstakingly, she began to dismantle her world and rebuild it to fit Leah's needs. She replaced the harsh crystal chandeliers with soft, warm lamps and learned to distinguish the different tones of Leah's humming, recognizing the vibrations of contentment versus those of rising distress. It was a humbling, exhausting transformation from judge to student. The first real breakthrough came not from a grand, calculated effort, but from a moment of simple, shared existence in the garden. Leah had been agitated all morning, a low, discordant hum signaling that a storm was brewing inside her. Remembering a passage from a book, Helena gently guided her outside to the overgrown flower beds at the edge of the property. She said nothing. She simply sat on the cool grass and began to pull weeds, her movements slow and rhythmic. Leah watched from a safe distance, her small body rigid with tension. Then, her gaze fell upon the rich tapestry of textures at her feet, the smooth, cool surface of a river stone, the rough, flaky bark of an old oak tree, the velvety softness of a patch of moss. Tentatively, she reached out, her fingers tracing the patterns of the natural world. The harsh hum softened, melting into a calmer, more melodic tune. This small victory changed everything. Helena began to consciously see the world through Leah's perspective. Noticing details she had overlooked her entire life, the way sunlight filtered through the canopy of leaves to dance on the ground, the intricate geometry of a spider's web in the corner of a window pane, the fleeting rainbow prism cast by a glass of water on the table. She realized that Leah's world was not one of absence or deficit, but one of intense, focused beauty. The girl didn't mourn what she couldn't process. She celebrated the profound richness of what she could. Sometimes the hardest part of finding your way is taking that first step into someone else's world. If you believe in the power of these journeys, please consider subscribing. Your support is what allows us to keep telling them. One evening, Helena found Leah in the grand living room, standing before a large gold-leaf mirror. She wasn't looking at herself, but at the reflection of a crystal vase on a nearby mantelpiece, her finger tracing its refracted, shimmering light on the glass. An idea sparked in Helena's memory. On a sudden, powerful impulse, she went to a locked chest in her bedroom and retrieved a small wooden music box, a treasured keepsake of Anna's that she hadn't touched in years. Her fingers trembled slightly as she wound the key. The soft, tinkling melody of a Brahms lullaby filled the cavernous, silent room. Leah turned from the mirror, her head cocked, her blue eyes wide with a look of pure, unadulterated wonder. She slowly walked toward the sound, placing her small hand on the polished wood, feeling the vibrations of the music against her palm, and for the very first time, a small, radiant smile touched Leah's lips. The town's annual Founders' Day festival was a cacophony of sensory overload, a world Helena had forgotten how to navigate. The cheerful, blaring music from the carousel warred with the shouts of vendors and the laughter of children. Strings of multicolored lights blinked in a dizzying rhythm, reflecting off the spinning rides and the excited faces of the crowd. For a while, Leah seemed mesmerized, her head turning from the bright flash of a fire-eater's torch to the sweet, cloying smell of cotton candy. But as the evening wore on and the crowd grew thicker, Helena felt the small hand in hers begin to tremble. The melodic hum deepened into a low, anxious vibration. Before Helena could guide them toward a quieter area, a sudden burst of fireworks lit up the sky with a deafening boom. In that single, explosive moment of chaos, Leah wrenched her hand free and vanished into the sea of moving bodies. A cold, familiar dread seized Helena, so powerful it stole the air from her lungs. This was not the rational fear of a guardian losing a child. It was the visceral, soul-crushing terror of a past she could never outrun. The cheerful sounds of the festival dissolved into a dull, mocking roar, replaced by the screech of tires on wet pavement and the shattering of glass from 2 decades ago. The faces in the crowd blurred into a meaningless collage of concern as the town's search began. People called Leah's name, their voices swallowed by the night, but Helena moved through them like a ghost. She was trapped in a solitary nightmare, reliving the most horrific moment of her life, the frantic, hopeless search for Anna. The universe, it seemed, was intent on making her pay for the same mistake twice, a cruel and unbearable penance for a grief she had never truly faced. Hours crawled by, each minute an eternity of failure. The festival's joyful energy had curdled into a town-wide anxiety, with volunteers fanning out with flashlights, their beams cutting uselessly through the darkness. Helena, however, broke away from the organized search. Driven by an instinct that was deeper than logic, she left the noise and the lights behind, her feet carrying her toward the quiet woods that bordered the fairgrounds. A faint, silver path, illuminated by the full moon, led her toward the gentle murmur of a stream. Her heart pounded a desperate, frantic rhythm against her ribs, a prayer with every beat. And then she saw her. In a small clearing by the water's edge, bathed in soft moonlight, Leah was perfectly safe, perfectly calm. She was meticulously building a small, elegant tower of smooth river stones, utterly absorbed in her silent, peaceful world. The wave of relief that crashed over Helena was so absolute it buckled her knees. She didn't shout or rush forward. She simply sank onto the dampest, cool earth a few feet away. The formidable armor of the iron-willed judge completely disintegrated. The tears she had locked away for 20 years finally broke free, streaming down her face in hot, silent rivers of pain and gratitude. "I thought I lost you," she whispered, her voice raw and broken, the words a confession to the silent woods and to the ghost of her past. "I thought I lost you, like I lost my Anna." The admission hung in the quiet air between them, a final, painful surrender to a sorrow that had defined her. Leah paused, her small hands hovering over her tower. She turned her head slowly, her immense blue eyes finding Helena's in the darkness, and for the first time they held a look of profound, quiet understanding. Leah's hand moved not to her tower, but to a special collection of stones beside her. She selected one carefully, the prize of her search, one that the flowing water had polished to a dark, smooth finish, its shape an uncanny, perfect heart. She crawled the small distance to Helena, and, with a solemnity that belied her age, placed the cool stone into Helena's trembling, outstretched palm. It was not a rock, it was an offering, a message, an anchor in the storm of Helena's grief. In that moment, holding the weight of that small, heart-shaped stone, the crushing weight of her past finally lifted. She wasn't replacing her daughter, she was learning to love again. Helena gently pulled Leah into an embrace, a true and heartfelt hug, and whispered the words that would redefine them both. "You're not Anna, you're Leah, and you are my daughter." The legal process of adoption was, for Helena, a familiar battlefield. But this time she fought not with cold logic, but with a fierce, protective love. The paperwork was a formality. The true adoption had already happened in a moonlit clearing by a stream. The grand Caldwell mansion, once a monument to grief, underwent a profound metamorphosis. Walls that had echoed with silence were now painted in soft, calming colors. A sprawling sensory garden replaced the perfectly manicured, sterile lawns, filled with fragrant herbs, smooth stones, and wind chimes that played a gentle melody. The dusty, unused ballroom was transformed into a sun-drenched art studio, its vast wooden floors soon to be covered in canvas and the vibrant chaos of creation. The house was no longer a fortress to keep the world out. It had become a sanctuary designed to let one special girl in, a space built not of wealth, but of understanding. In the quiet sanctuary of her new studio, Leah found her voice. It wasn't a voice of words, but one of brilliant, explosive color. With brushes clutched in her small hands, she communicated the world as she saw it, a place of intense feeling and breathtaking detail. Her canvases were filled with the swirling blues of a Brahms lullaby, the jagged reds of a firework's sudden boom, and the soft, mossy greens of a peaceful garden. Helena would spend hours just watching her, mesmerized. She learned to read the stories in Leah's paintings, to understand her joys and her fears through the strokes of a brush. The town, once so quick to judge, began to see not a reclusive widow and a broken child, but a mother and daughter communicating in a language more profound than speech. The whispers of gossip were replaced by murmurs of awe. Helena's transformation extended far beyond the walls of her home. The woman who once observed Golden Ridge from a detached distance now walked among its people, not as a judge, but as an advocate. Fueled by a new, unshakable purpose, she liquidated a significant portion of her assets and established the Heartstone Foundation, a regional center dedicated to providing resources, therapy, and support for children with disabilities and their families. She turned her formidable intellect and influence toward building a system of acceptance, ensuring no other parent would feel the desperation that led to Leah's abandonment, and no other child would be seen as a burden. The Iron Widow was gone, replaced by the quiet, determined heart of the community, her personal healing becoming a wellspring of hope for countless others. Years melted away, filled with the quiet rhythm of a life rebuilt. Helena found that her heart, which she had believed broken beyond repair, had not just healed, but had grown larger, more capable of love than she had ever imagined. Her purpose was no longer found in legal victories or public esteem, but in the warmth of a small hand in hers and the silent, beautiful language of a shared life. The heart-shaped stone Leah had given her remained on her desk, a constant reminder that the deepest wounds can give birth to the most profound strength. And that family is a choice you make every single day. Stories like this show us that a single act of love can change the world, and by subscribing, you help us continue to share these powerful testaments to the human spirit.